One of the biggest fights I've ever had the privilege of seeing live was way back in 2001. It was Hopkins versus Trinidad live at Madison Square Garden. I truly lucked out because I did not have tickets to that fight. I just happened to be at Gleason's gym the morning of the fight, Saturday morning, doing my workout, and a trainer from Long Island, I can't remember his name, I apologize, but thank you so much, because he just out of nowhere came up to me and said, "Hey D, you want tickets to the fight tonight?" I'm like, "Yes, definitely," so he just gifted me with 2 tickets. So it turned out that was my friend's birthday, so I gifted a friend of mine one of the tickets, but we didn't wind up going together because I wanted to go early and I think he had things to do. So the reason I wanted to go early was because I knew in advance that I was going to bogart my way closer to the ring than where my assigned seat was. So you used to be able to do this at MSG. I don't know if you could still pull it off, but I did just that. I made sure I got there early, like probably around 3:34, because it was a Don King promotion. And if you remember Don King cards from back in the day, they started early because Don King had signed so many fighters. He had to fill up all of his cards to meet his obligations to the fighters he'd signed. So, point was, if you're gonna go to a Don King card and get there from the beginning, it was gonna be like a marathon for you as a spectator. So I knew I was gonna be in for a long afternoon, evening. But that was sort of the trade-off, right? Trying to get a better seat, better show up early when the stands are still sort of empty, so I could sneak in and get a better seat. And I did just that. I wasn't gonna have the balls to go try to get ringside, but I went in sort of that mezzanine area just in front of the railings, a few rows down and in from the aisles. So it was kind of trying to be nondescript, and I truly lucked out just because for the whole night nobody came and said, "Hey, you're sitting in my seat," so I'd never had to get up and move. So it was really a lot of good luck for me on that day. Alright, so that was September 28th, 2001. And the reason Hopkins Trinidad is such a memorable fight is not just because of the outcome of the fight, which we know Hopkins stopped Trinidad in the 12th and final round. But there's so much more to it than just the final outcome, and even how Hopkins won, which was surprising to a lot of people. So there's actually about, I think, 5 different layers of narrative building up to Hopkins Trinidad. I'm going to break it down for you. So the first layer is the fact that it's a unification bout. And Don King, really smart guy, the way he set this up was there were 2 semifinals. So one was Bernard Hopkins versus Keith Holmes, and I believe Bernard held the IBF and the WBC belts at middleweight. And then the other semifinal was Felix Trinidad versus William Joppy, and I believe William Joppy held the WBA. But even if he didn't hold it, that was the belt that was on the line for that other semifinal. So the smart thing about Don King is he doesn't really care who wins, right? It doesn't matter if the person who's supposed to win wins or not, because someone's going to hold the belt at the end of the night. Even if it's draw, whoever held the belt retains the belt, right? So someone's coming out with 2 belts on one side, 1 belt on the other, and no matter what, Don King gets to make a unification bout down the road. So he's winning no matter who wins or loses. By contrast, look at what happened this past weekend. Wilder loses to Parker, which he wasn't supposed to do, and now the whole mega fight between Joshua Wilder, we don't know if that's going to happen or not. And quite frankly, I personally don't even want to see that. I don't know about you, but yeah, I have no interest in seeing that anyways. But back to Hopkins Trinidad. So there's that narrative. The fact that no matter what, there's going to be a unification bout down the line. Okay, so that in and of itself has to generate some interest from boxing fans and media and just the boxing industry itself. Everybody has sort of an interest at stake. Okay, so then the second layer is what actually happened in those two semifinal bouts. I believe it was Bernard and Keith fought in April of 2001, and Bernard won that fight. And then a month later, Trinidad fought and beat William Joppy in May. But the talk was really about how each of those fighters won their respective fights. So in Hopkins versus Holmes, it was a very sort of tactical, grinding fight where Hopkins really just would tie up Holmes and neutralize him, and he eked out a decision, but it was not like a scintillating fight by any means. So the take on that, I guess, was, well, Hopkins is a really great tactician, but not an exciting fighter to watch. So that was a story coming out of his semifinal. Now, on the other hand, the story coming out of Trinidad's semifinal versus Joppy was, well, he knocked him out. And everyone was like just saying how spectacular he looked with that left hook. Now, bear in mind, Trinidad was moving up, I think, from welter. I don't know if he had already had one fight at junior middle, but now he was moving up to middleweight. That was his trajectory at the time. So to see him or have him knock out William Joppy was really like the talk of the boxing town. And I remember my trainer, Lennox Blackmore, he's a former fighter, and he's a world-class trainer, so he's not easily impressed. But he was even, just raving about Tito's left hook. He said, he was close to ringside for that fight. He said you could just hear the wind like off of Tito's left hook. That's how fast and powerful it was. All right, so those are the two sort of stories coming out of the semifinal. Hopkins won, but he's a boring fighter. He's a tactician, whereas Tito scored this, spectacular fifth round knockout and looked great. All right, so that's the sort of second layer of narrative. Now the third layer is, now that we know that Hopkins and Trinidad are going to meet in this final unification bout, you've got the Puerto Rican fighter, Felix Trinidad, coming to New York City to fight. And anytime that happens, Paulie Malignaggi would tell you, New York, Puerto Rican boxing, it's just a huge boxing crowd, huge boxing community that wants to support the fighter from Puerto Rico. And like, in all fairness, it's bigger than just Puerto Ricans and boxing and a Puerto Rican fighter. There's something just about the fact that if you live in New York, you absorb Puerto Rican culture. Like, you there's no way you're not gonna absorb Puerto Rican culture if you live in New York, because it's gonna be either the food or the music. You're gonna eat chicken. You're gonna have in New York, you get your choice. You can get white rice or yellow rice. You can get black beans or red beans. It's not like Cali rice and beans. New York rice and beans is different. But in any case, you're gonna eat the chicken. You're gonna eat plantain. You're gonna eat rice and beans, guaranteed. And you're gonna hear salsa. You're gonna hear merengue. Doesn't matter what part of New York City you live in, because during the summer, people drive around, blast their music in their car. People blast their music on the weekends out there. They put the speaker in the window facing out, so you're gonna hear the music. And streets in New York, the cross streets are pretty narrow, so you got that neighbor across the street blasting their music, the speaker in the window. You're hearing it, no matter what. And then, of course, we got the little block parties and the weekend backyard parties. You're hearing the music. Just enjoy it, right? So, my point is, Puerto Rican, or if you want to call it New Yorican culture, is just part of New York City. And so the fact that a Puerto Rican fighter is coming to New York City for a big fight, it's just kind of like gets everybody kind of excited, and even people who aren't huge boxing fans get excited about that moment that's about to happen. So that's sort of the third layer. We got a unification bout. We have Bernard not looking so thrilling in his semifinal. We have Tito looking amazing in his semifinal. We got a Puerto Rican fighter, Tito Trinidad, superstar, coming to New York City to fight in front of the Puerto Rican, New Yorican crowd and all boxing fans. And then on top of that, during the lead up to this fight, we had this narrative of Bernard Hopkins grabbing the Puerto Rican flag and throwing it down on the ground. And that made huge news, right? This is well before social media, so there's only newsprint, right? New York Post, New York Daily News. We have the Spanish papers, I guess El Diario. I'm not really sure, sorry, but the names of the papers were in New York City. And then we have the local news, of course. But this fact that Bernard grabbed that flag and threw it on the ground and mayhem ensued, that became part of the narrative. And to hear Bernard's side of the story, definitely listen to his podcast with Joe Rogan, where he recounts from his point of view the whole buildup of that media tour to the flag throwing incident. So my point is, you may not hear about that in retrospect, but for those of us that are around at that time, that was a big narrative, because some people felt, well, hey, Bernard just disrespected the entire nation of Puerto Rico and all Puerto Ricans, and other people were like, nah, that doesn't mean anything, Tito's still going to beat him, this, that, and the other. So there's sort of like the narrative and the spin-off narratives, but the point is it's in the conversation regardless. All right, so in a sense, props to Bernard for knowing how to play the media game back at that time. So finally, and this may be sort of one of the biggest aspects of setting the stage and the atmosphere for this fight. This fight took place, it was originally scheduled for September 15, 2001. It was originally scheduled for 4 days after 9/11. Of course, that didn't happen, but it got pushed out only 2 weeks. Okay, so just September 28th, just a couple weeks after 9/11. I mean, it's hard for me to put into words what it felt like to be in New York at that time, but you can imagine everybody's still devastated. Everyone's still in shock or in mourning. I personally did not know anyone directly that perished in the 9/11, but we were all maybe 1 degree of separation away from somebody that did. So, like, for example, there was a firefighter who used to train at Gleason's gym who perished because he and his engine, rushed into the fray to try to rescue people. So I guess, if you were there, you know what it felt like, but if you weren't there, you can only imagine. Like, the entire city is devastated. The entire city is in mourning. We're still in shock. And it was almost like we needed this big event to kind of just take our minds off of what we were feeling, to just reassure us that, yes, we're still New York. We still have big fights. People still flock to Madison Square Garden. We're still the center of the boxing universe, so to speak. And, life can continue. We kind of needed this huge event to let us know that, life was going to continue. In spite of our grief, in spite of the tragedy, and in spite of the fact that it was still going to take years and years for people to come to terms with what they lost. So yeah, it's hard for me to put into words what that felt like at that time, but that's really like the big sort of layer of narrative that's over all of this. It's just really more the 9/11 sort of aftermath, or whatever you want to, however you want to phrase that. Okay, so that sort of sets the stage for this fight. So let's talk about the actual fight. Well, as I said, I did get there early and bogart my way down to a better seat, and I can remember sort of starting to pay attention like about 3 fights in, because it was Ricardo Lopez on the undercard. The great Ricardo Lopez, junior flyweight, undefeated, by the way, 50-0, I think, and 1 draw, but he's also 50-0. Trained by Nacho Beristain, and I just remember watching him get in his very disciplined stance in the corner before the fight started, and he just had that I don't know what you want to call it, sort of Eastern European guard, but he was just so disciplined with it. He'd stay there and kind of bounce on his feet before the bell rang, and that was what turned out to be his final fight, and he knocked out his opponent. So it was a wonderful swan song for him. And as it turned out, I just realized it was also Arthur McCanty Sr.'s final bout that he reffed, as I think he was over 81 at the time. And his son, Arthur McCanty Jr., also reffed another fight further down on that card. But so that's sort of an historical fight, because it was Ricardo Finito Lopez's final fight as well as Arthur McCanty Sr.'s final fight. But the point was, while I was watching that fight, I could already hear the Puerto Rican fans in the stands. They were circulating through the stands, banging on drums. They had noisemakers or some kind of instrument or something, and so they were like kind of making music and chanting, Tito, Tito, and this is like maybe 5 fights before the main event, and it's already starting to build. The Tito cheers, and so you can imagine as it's building towards the main event, this energy and this noise and the banging on the drums and the cheering is just starting to build and build and build, all the way, of course, till ring entrance, national anthems, all of this. It's just built to a huge crescendo. So the arena's now started to fill up more. I would say it's at least 95% full. But yeah, I mean, the energy was just incredible. Now, the thing is, once the first bell rings, energy's still there. People are cheering for Tito. He's definitely the favorite, the crowd favorite in this fight. But the first few rounds start out kind of slow, feel-out rounds. And then as it starts to pick up, it starts to look like there's some back and forth exchanges. And of course, every time Tito lands something, the crowd goes crazy. And it's still really loud. The energy's still really in favor of Tito. But what's starting to become apparent is that Bernard's not fighting the same fight like how he fought Keith Holmes. He's actually boxing and moving around, right? So it's a different fight from Bernard than we expected. And the momentum is still for Tito through maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th. It starts to shift a little bit. And now as we get past the middle rounds into 7th, 8th, 9th, it's starting to become apparent that this fight may be moving away from Tito. So the energy's still there cheering for him. But as we get towards 8th, 9th, 10th, it's starting to become cheering of, I don't call it like desperation, but cheering of like, come on, Tito, you can still do it, like that type of spirit in the cheering. But as this fight goes on, 8th, 9th, yeah, the cheers start to dissipate, and then in the 10th, Bernard hurts him. So now people are really it's really more, a you can do it cheer. right? And the 11th, he's hurt. It's apparent that he's hurt. And then finally, when he comes out for the 12th, he gets dropped by Bernard, and Tito's dad just jumps in the ring and stops the fight, and that's that. But I've never heard anything like the whole crowd go from this huge crescendo at the beginning of the fight to just slowly coming down, down, down. And, sadly at the end their guy gets KO'd. So what are my takeaways from that? Well, one, it was a hugely memorable event, and I'm so lucky I was able to be there live. But I think the big takeaway looking back is that let's give Bernard Hopkins credit where credit's due, because that was a mental game that he fought that night. He caught us, the spectators, by surprise by not fighting the way we expected him to fight. He wasn't the Bernard Hopkins tactician. He turned himself into Bernard Hopkins, a boxer who took away Tito's best weapon, which was his left hook. Now, I'm going to assume that Bernard and his corner came up with this game plan, but regardless of who was sort of the mastermind behind that, whether it was Bernard himself, Bernard and his trainer, Bernard had the presence of mind, no matter what, to stick to that and be very disciplined and not revert to something else. And that takes huge presence of mind, because no matter what, it's Tito's dangerous, and he's gonna he did catch Bernard with some exchanges, but Bernard didn't just then shift back into to his old self or a different game plan. He stuck to the proper game plan. That takes huge mental presence. The second thing is sort of in that lead up with the whole flag throwing. Again, listen to what Bernard has to say on Joe Rogan's podcast, because there's also something there in that. Was this calculated? Was this emotional? Or was it calculated to get an emotional response from Felix Trinidad? Bernard says it was the latter. Only he knows for sure what motivated him to do what he did with the flag, grabbing it and throwing it. But the point is, it did work in the sense that it catalyzed a lot of conversation, a lot of emotion from the fans, and it got media attention. So if that was calculated on Bernard's part, then you got to take your hat off to him for knowing how to manipulate the media and the fans to tune in, which is in the end all what they want, right? As a fighter, you want people to tune in, whether it's to see you win or to see you lose. You want them to tune in. Third thing is, I don't know that we'll ever get to see a moment like that again in boxing. Hopefully we will. But remember, this was back when it was HBO was still a player, so this was an HBO pay-per-view event. This was orchestrated by, I guess, Don King and the folks at HBO. But it's I'm not so sure that we can see a moment like this again. Of course, we don't want the narrative of this tragedy of 9/11 overtop a boxing event again. But I don't know that we can have the whole sort of semi-final thing play out properly. So there's a final with the belt unification and two valid A sides coming together to fight each other. It feels like everything in the boxing industry at the moment is very sort of manufactured, and so for a moment like this to kind of coalesce and arise out of just what's happening in the world and happening in boxing, I'm not sure it can happen. But the point is, let's give props to Bernard for effectively, I guess we could say he pulled off an upset in that fight. But let's give props to Bernard also for having the mental savvy and the smarts to execute, as the executioner or the alien, execute his game plan to the fullest extent for a very decisive outcome, which is the knockout. I'm not sure it can happen. But the point is, let's give props to Bernard for effectively, I guess we could say he pulled off an upset in that fight. But let's give props to Bernard also for having the mental savvy and the smarts to execute, as the executioner or the alien, execute his game plan to the fullest extent for a very decisive outcome, which is the knockout. Now, one additional move that Bernard Hopkins made in this fight that I thought was absolutely genius was he got a temporary tattoo on his back that said Golden Casino, and it took up the entire width of his back. It was in black, temporary ink, and you could see it from far away. The letters were big enough, and he has brought enough back that you could see that. Now, it did slowly start to wear off as the fight went on from all the sweat and the contact with Tito. But Golden Casino was very clearly there for a good part of the fight. And supposedly, whatever amount that Bernard got paid by the casino, he supposedly took that and told him, hey, put it on me, because he knew he was the betting underdog. So supposedly he came away with a good chunk of money by literally betting on himself. Now, I don't know if that story's true, and he hasn't alluded to that publicly, so maybe it's just one of those things where he doesn't really want to talk about it. But I think after Bernard did that tattoo move on his back, I think the commissions then put a rule in place where fighters aren't allowed to do that. But in my opinion, it's absolutely brilliant to use a temporary tattoo, because fighters have very limited real estate to sell, right? Most male fighters only have their trunks. All you can sell is maybe an area that big for a potential sponsor advertiser. Whereas right across your back, that's prime real estate. Everybody's going to see it, and there's plenty of space there. So again, kudos to Bernard Hopkins for having the brilliance to see that move to make. So what was the best fight you ever saw live? Please comment, share in the comments below. Thank you.